everyone, Hafsa here. Up until now, we focused on the basics of animation and how we plan and draw our main action. But we've only done that with basic shapes and very basic materials. Now we want to add some details to our animation because usually a character design will have small additional objects which are stuck to it, such as clothing and hair, and might even have some additional special characteristics depending on what it's made out of. For example, if your character has clothing made out of stretchy materials or something like armor which is very rigid, they're going to be moving in a different way than to regular clothing or than a character without any details whatsoever. We spoke about this subject in the second character design video, but the way that we're going to animate each different part of your character design is going to be different depending on what it is made out of and its shape and cut of clothing. And if we're trying to animate additional props which are not even alive, we need to consider what they are in order to animate them correctly as well. First, and same as with any other animation subject that we've done until now, you need to understand the characteristics of the object you're animating. You need to understand what materials they're made of, how durable they are, if they have any inherent traits such as elasticity, stickiness, or internal friction, which affects the textures and how they can move. And this will help you predict and plan how these objects are going to interact with the environment, which helps you know how to draw them correctly for each pose and how to use timing to show the characteristics. Because you're trying to animate something which is not alive or something that has specific properties to it, you need to understand how to show these properties. This can be done by either deforming the object itself in a way that helps us understand what material it is made out of, or if the object itself is too rigid and have properties which prevent it from changing its look, you need to show how it affects the environment. You can also play around with the ratio of how much it affects the environment as opposed to how much the environment affects the object to show the characteristics of the object better. For example, here we have 3 balls with 3 inherent traits. You can see the change in their movement and how I'm going to plan their animation. The elastic ball will greatly deform when it impacts the ground, and it will have a big amount of acceleration on its way up. So we're going to use a lot of smear frames as well as give it quick timing. The second ball is somewhere in between rigid and elastic, so it transfers some of the force of the impact into the ground each time it reaches it, making it deform only slightly and have a much lower endpoint on its trajectory on the way up. So here I'm not deforming the ball quite as much, and I'm using much quicker timing because the overall trajectory is smaller than the elastic ball. The last ball is both heavy and durable, and thus we will show its characteristics by the way it affects the environment, because it by itself cannot be changed if we want to show that it is very heavy. Here I will not even bother giving it an upward trajectory. We want to sell the impact of the ball with the ground as much as we can by just shattering the ground and letting the ball stick where it is. When we understand the characteristics inherent to the object, we can start and incorporate them into the way that we animate it. For example, your object can be quite solid but fragile if it hits from certain stress points. Building upon these characteristics, you can intentionally design the movement of your object to showcase them. So you actually want to create something that shatters the object of your animation. Make sure to keep in mind the correct volume of your object when you're animating it, and the forcing acting upon it throughout the movement, which make it change its shape and position. You need to make sure that you're not accidentally increasing or decreasing the volume of your object, or that it suddenly changes shapes without any causes. Basically, you need to make sure that you keep your object on model, even if it's not an actual character or a part of the character's design. When animating objects, they're usually not going to be the main focus of your scene. This is going to be the actual characters in it, and the objects are going to be just flavoring to the character design or to the background design. So they wouldn't be drawn with the same amount of focus and detail as the actual characters. This means that you have to be very smart and very effective in the way that you show the character characteristics with the animation itself. Basically, you need to exaggerate the animation to show the properties of the objects and the materials that it is made out of. That being said, you don't want to make the movement too exaggerated, because this might distract from the main focus of the scene, which is the character action, or it might even clash with the overall animation style in the scene, which can be quite jarring. Also, you need to make sure that your exaggerated movement is making sense in the context of the scene, because the eye is naturally drawn to movement, so you don't want to make something which suddenly appears into your scene out of context and basically refocuses the viewer attention on a small background detail instead of what is really important in the scene, just because it is moving while the rest of the scene is static. When you're adding your details to your character or to your background, you need to make sure that they actually match the timing of the overall scene. For character design details, it's actually a lot easier because their action is going to be related to the character's action by either using the momentum of the movement to complete the overall feeling of the action that the character performs by giving additional momentum to the details, or by showing how the environment affects the character using the clothing, such as with wind or water, which changes the animation of the hair and clothing. But if you're having something like a background animation or any other special effects animation, it means that you refocuses the viewer attention on this part. Or if you're making something that is very subtle, you might risk the audience not seeing it at all and it being unnecessary. So you really need to make sure that your timing and your object are being told and animated in the best way that is possible to support the scene, and not just create something for the sake of creating it when adding effects and object animation. Here you can see that just by giving simple shapes certain characteristics when I animate them, I can convey something which is quite easy to understand. You have a very rigid cube which is breaking upon impact with the ground, you have a very elastic ball, and you have a falling sack of grain. Now the animation on each one of them is quite simple. As you can see, I don't take a lot of time to animate each part of the movement. But when I make a version which is incorrect or where the movement is too exaggerated, you can definitely tell that it is moving incorrectly, and it's quite distracting. So when you're trying to animate your objects, make as many adjustments as necessary to make sure that they fit with your scene and the style of animation, and not just look good individually. Of course, when creating our actions, we'll be using all the concepts and techniques that we've learned up until now. Because we're animating single objects which are made out of a very rigid material at this point, we're going to animate them the same way that we animated any other object with a solid center of mass, which is more affected by the main action and not the environment around it. We're going to use the ease in and ease out animation patterns, as well as the squash and stretch, delay and overshoot concept, which help us visualize and clearly show the animation of the object that we're trying to make. I'm going to show you how we're using deformation to show different types of materials with this example here. I'll be showing you examples of 3 different materials with different amount of elasticity in them, and to demonstrate that I will be animating 3 different versions of a ball on a string. Here, the materials that we're trying to animate is not the ball, but actually the string. And the way that we're going to showcase the material properties is by seeing how it affects the environment around it and how the environment affects it. The way that we show the inherent elasticity of the material is not done by seeing how it looks when it is in complete tension, because this is just the straight line that connects between the 2 tension points in your object, but actually by the way that the tension is being released. As you can see, in the first example, the material is very rigid. The material itself does not have an inherent elasticity to it, and thus there's no additional force changing the ball's trajectory, resulting in a very mild deformation of the string, because there is no release from tension. The second example shows a material with more built-in elasticity. To show this elasticity, we will deform the string a little bit more than in the first example, and show that it has its own internal force of elasticity by the way that it alters the original trajectory of the ball to create an effect of overshoot. You can see here that the release of tension in the string is not uniform. The string is still mostly being held in tension at the edge of the range, but small parts of it have their tension released, and this release in tension is traveling along the string like a wave, starting from the point further away from the force which creates the tension, all the way until the end of the string. The last example shows a very elastic material. Here, the movement of the ball itself is being very visibly affected by the elastic force which is created by the string. This will look like a full deformation of the string, and we will use impact frames and overshoot to give emphasis to the placement of the tension points, similarly to the way that we animate impact frames and smear frames. Basically, at the point where the tension is highest, we're actually going to show the elasticity of the string by making it reach a further point than it would have been able to do than if it was just a straight line. And when we're releasing the tension of the string, we're going to curve it a lot more than we would have if it was than if there wasn't an additional force which accelerates the ball on its way upwards. Basically, here we have a battle between the force of gravity, which pulls the ball down, and the elasticity of the string, which accelerates the ball upwards. This is what happens when you have 2 forces actively acting on your object, making it constantly accelerating and deaccelerating in patterns in opposing directions. By understanding the properties that we want to give the materials and what kind of forces act on it, we know how to plan our movement and which technique we're going to use to showcase these material properties. Now let's see what happens when we actually try to animate our character motion with details. This is actions and motions that are created by the character itself and not the environment. So here we have a clear trajectory of the movement, but we also have a changing contact point. In these cases, again, we need to take into consideration the materials of the clothing and hair that we're trying to animate, as well as the overall forces that are acting on them. Because here, the force is going to be from the character movement itself. So it's basically going to be affected by momentum, the same way that the complex action is affecting the limbs, as we've seen in a previous video. But in this case, we also have the additional wave pattern that is created by the internal tension of the animated object. So basically, what we're going to do in order to combine these two forces which are acting on the character is basically replicate the trajectory of the character movement into the trajectory of your material movement, and have a small delay between each one of them. When I try and animate details to my character, I think about two things. First, what is the trajectory of the character? This is what I start with. I do not animate the details until I have the complete trajectory of the character with its final timing done. And then I add the character details following the actual movement of the character. So, for example, if the character is falling, like we can see here, I'm going to make the materials follow the movement. Here, the tension in the material itself is going to stretch it in the other direction of the movement. So basically, if your character is falling down, your details are going to move up. Because the character is moving in a curve, when it's moving to the right, the hair and materials are going to move to the left. And when it's coming to a stop, they're still going to move in their initial trajectory because of momentum. The materials are also going to accelerate and deaccelerate according to momentum and with taking gravity into account. So they're always going to accelerate faster on the way down. The size of the material and details is going to affect the way that we're going to animate them as well, due to two reasons. The first is because the overall range of the material is going to be smaller. It's not going to have as much opportunity to curve around as with materials which are longer and bigger. The second is because there is a much more pronounced difference in weight when the material is longer. As I've mentioned before, the weight of each material closer to the originating contact point is much greater than the weight at the edges of the material. So even if the tension point is following the trajectory of the character, it's going to move much quicker by the edges of the material than at the beginning of the material. As you can see with this example, when the clothing material is bigger, I have more opportunities to fold and deform the overall shape of the cloth. And because it has more weight to it, the overall trajectory when the character is reaching the edge of the movement is going to be bigger and more noticeable than before. Instead of having a small delay because the material is reaching the resting point quite quickly, we have a much further delay, and the overall range is going to be bigger. But because it also has more weight to it, gravity is going to accelerate it at a much greater rate. The range itself is getting shortened. So when your material is bigger, it's going to like a single object, as we've done with the smaller materials, actually like a bunch of connected parts. Here we're going to animate its center of gravity, similarly to what we've done with complex animation. What you want to do is treat each part of the movement range like an independent part in the overall structure of the material. create different trajectories for each part using the center of mass each part. Even though the starting range is going to have a trajectory which follows very closely the trajectory of your character action, middle and end ranges of your material are going to act differently, and they're going to be affected directly by the beginning part of the material. So even if the initial trajectory of the end part is much bigger and theoretically would have stretched a lot further than the character action, because the beginner part and the middle part of the movement range are still going to follow the character action and pull the overall material down, the overall range of it is going to be shortened as well. There's also a unique situation that occurs whenever your character action is actually a lot quicker than what the character design details can handle, which creates extreme delay between the character details and your character action. In these cases, the character details are going to be stretched and reach the edges of the range of movement. This is, again, the straight line between their contact point and the entire length of your material without any folds in it. When this situation occurs, we're basically creating a wave pattern which moves along the material very quickly. And when the character is moving very quickly, it's going to lift up from the initial position it was in, and then be subject to a resistance. We can see here with this example that the character is spinning very quickly. Now, the spin itself creates constant force in the same direction, but because the hair is separated into multiple smaller parts, each one of them is going to be affected differently. So, when the movement starts, the drag effect is still pretty simple. The hair is going to shift to the opposite direction of the spin. But when the spin is very forceful, it's going to straighten it as well and lift the hair up in two different directions. We want to show it by curving each part of the hair in the opposite direction, but still following the spin. You can see here that by extending the hair to the sides, we're also actually increasing the volume of the head, kind of. And then, as soon as the spin ends and subsides, the hair immediately starts falling down again, at which point we're going to use a wave pattern to show the overall movement of the hair. Each part is going to continue the trajectory of the spin because of momentum, and when it reaches the edge of the movement range, it's going to go back, which again creates the wave. Because of hair resistance and the inherent tension of the hair, it's going to go back and forth until it reaches its final rest. If you want to show variations with the character hair or with the force which is created by their character action, you need to make changes to the amount of lift that your hair is going to have during the spin and the size of the angle of the hair in relation to the head spin. A very important thing to remember is that you need to make sure that each part of your hair is originating from the same spot. So when the head is spinning and showing different angles, you need to make sure that the hairline and the overall length of each hair group is staying consistent throughout every single frame. This type of movement is not actually unique to hair or to spinning movement. You can use this concept of lifting and changing the momentum and the wave patterns of your materials for each action which is too quick for your character design details to follow immediately. It can be during fall, during actions, or during quick changes in direction. But the most important thing to remember is that your character details do need to complete their entire trajectory. So even if one part of your character detail is closely following your character action, the edges of your material are still going to complete their initial trajectory. This is going to create quite a lot of deformation, so you need to make sure that you leave enough time for the materials and character design details to catch up to the character even when they are performing quick actions. Otherwise, you might risk scenarios where the character details don't have enough time to shift angles and drag behind the character action, which going to make it look like the details are stuck in place. Here you can use the same trick that we've done before and just divide the overall character design details into different independent parts according to their range from their contact point. And if you have multiple contact points, you just need to make sure that you connect them with the line as we've done before. Now that we understand how we can use material properties using tension, let's see how we apply this concept into actual animation. First, let's see the examples when animating objects in a natural state, meaning that the action and the movement of the detail and materials is not created by the character movement, just by being in the environment. This is what we're going to see with wind or water, and we will need to adjust it accordingly, as we're going to see right now. First, what we need to do is to find the tension point which creates the movement. This is where your materials are attached to a singular point, be it on the character if the character itself is not moving, or as part of the environment. This is the easy part because this is basically what you can actually see. This is a very constant point that you can always refer to. But your second tension point, which actually creates the movement, is a little bit more tricky to figure out because it will always be moving. The first tension point is going to serve as your anchor and reference for the range of movement of the entire object that you're trying to animate. You just see what is the length of your object of animation and make a half circle surrounding the tension point, which shows you the entire range. You need to make sure that whatever you do, you don't go over this range, because this is just breaking the model of your detail. As you can see, the closer you are to the contact point, the smaller the distance your material will need to cover when it's moving in that part of the range. While the further away from the contact point the material is, the bigger the distance you need to cover. Basically, the speed of the material is changing along the length of it, which means that each movement along the material is basically accelerating, and acceleration is equal force. This second force, which is traveling along the material, is the second tension point. You can kind of imagine that your tension point is holding the material in a similar way to the single anchor point, which is what's creating the wave which is moving along the material. The tension point is slowly going to move along the material from the originating contact point until it reaches the end of it, while slowly accelerating along the way. This means that any type of movement that you're going to animate closer to the original contact point is going to be much smaller than movement that you're going to have at the edge of your material. This is true for any type of force that is affecting the material, be it wind or gravity, or even the actions of the character. Any action that you're going to make on the material is going to be much bigger by the edges of it than at the beginning, because it has either its own weight or just a bigger range of movement altogether. Which makes it so it can cover a much further distance much quicker because it has less weight. When there is a force that is constantly acting on your object, such as wind, gravity, or floating in water, your object is going to move in predictable loops. Basically, just by moving, the object creates more tension within itself. So it can constantly generate new tension points, which will create sort of like a wave pattern, which you can animate as a loop to save time. The amount of tension which is held within the material depends on its inherent properties, and the amount of time that the tension point takes to travel along the material depends on the force which is creating the tension in the first place. The bigger the force, the faster it's going to travel along the material, and the bigger the tension within the material is, the wider the deformation that we're going to animate within the material. Same as we've seen in the last section. Basically, when you're trying to animate cloth or hair or any other movement which is very free and moves in a wave-like pattern, you need to consider that you need to make sure that the overall shape of it is animated correctly, more so than any small detail in it. Because this is where you can see the tension and the force behind the movement most clearly, as opposed to just the smaller details which are only helping it. Basically, you need to make sure that you're not breaking the overall wave pattern whenever you're trying to animate hair or cloth. Especially if you're trying to create realistic animation, because this is where you're going to make sure that you're taking the properties of your object, such as its weight and elasticity, into account when animating it, and creating a coherent shape to it. What I mean by that is that you need to make variation within your animation and not just have one slowly moving tension point along the line. The tension point itself is going to move in curves or accelerate or deaccelerate in accordance to the forces that are working on the material, in the same way that we've done with any other object up until now. A lot of the time you will see people trying to animate hair or cloth just by having one tension point which is traveling with even intervals and in constant speed along the materials. This is usually creating very pretty animation, but it's not very realistic, and a lot of the time it would not fit the movement that you're trying to create. So let's say that you want to create variations in your speed of movement, or the overall force and direction of the object being animated. For this, you basically just create a straight line. This will be your reference and guide for the entire movement. From this point, what you're going to do is actually create some curves with acceleration and different spacing, which are going to be the trajectory of the force that you're trying to animate. Remember to take into account both the actual force which is acting on your object and the actual characteristics of the object itself and how they're going to affect that trajectory. At this point, you're basically just trying to animate a ball in a trajectory which looks good. From here, you're going to animate the line and curve it along the trajectory of the ball that we animated before, with the ball being the tension point. And you need to take into consideration that when the tension point is close to the contact point, your material is not going to be very deformed, but by the edges, it is going to be very deformed. But when you're animating the tension points closer to the contact point, the ends of the materials that you're trying to animate are going to be at the edge of their movement range, because we're holding the rest of the material closer to its middle range. And when the tension point is traveling closer to the material, it's naturally going to rise up. When the tension point is reaching the end of the material, it's still going to move at the same trajectory because of momentum. But once the momentum is completely gone, it's going to start accelerating in the opposite direction. So the curve of the material is going to flip to the other direction on its way back. This is true for any type of flexible materials that you're trying to animate, or as a one-time action. Keep in mind that slower movement of tension points is going to create milder slopes, while quicker movement of tension points is going to result in a deformation of the entire object. When you have more than one contact point, or when you have multiple forces acting on your object, your material is going to have multiple clashing wave patterns which affect each other. When we have multiple contact points affecting the object at the same time, each one of them is going to create a wave pattern independent of the other. But because they are still connected through the same material, it's actually going to create a wave pattern along a plane and not just a singular line. We basically need to connect the two tension points together with a straight line. You will see this a lot in flags and in clothing, which have multiple contact points and are connected together through the seam. Here what you're going to do is basically add additional lines connecting between each wave in the pattern. You want to make sure that both of them move in a way that makes sense and not completely destroy the overall shape of the material. By this I mean that if you see that your wave patterns are affecting the entire wave pattern of your material, you need to reposition them in a way that shows the material movement clearly. If we're trying to work with something which is a little bit more complex, such as hair, which is composed of many individual strands which can move in independent direction, instead of cloth which can only move in one direction, we need to consider each part of the hair individually. Because it would not be affected by multiple tension points, because each one of them is connected to a different one, we have more freedom in the overall shape of the hair. But we still don't want to make it move in individual wave in many different directions, because this just doesn't show us where the force is coming from. If we have a change in the direction of the force or with its strength, we need to show the overall shape of the hair moving together, because even though each part of it can move individually, they're still going to be affected by the same force, so there's no reason for it to move in different direction. But because we want to show that it is hair and not cloth, it's a good idea to have some opposing wave patterns, which are still moving in the same direction. So as you can see here, when I want to switch the direction of the force, I'm making some part of the hair move from the top and some of it from the bottom, to give it a more rounded and 3D look. But they're still going to move to the same direction. And the overall shape of the hair is still moving in a very coherent wave. If your material is heavy, or by making the initial force very weak, you factor in gravity as a source of tension, which is going to limit both the direction and the range of movement of your material. As you can see here, by introducing gravity into the equation, we have wilder wave patterns, or we have materials which almost don't move, and the entire movement is conveyed by the overall shape of the material and not by the individual waves which create it. Another example of forces that are going to affect your character details is air resistance, or any other resistance depending on the environment of your character. You can see that with water and space as well. In these examples, the character movement and the environment are going to clash with each other and change the trajectory of your material as it moves along. Here you can see that the cloth is hanging from the ball, and when the ball is moving, the cloth is going to move with it due to momentum, same as we've seen in the last lesson and the character being affected by outside forces. Here though, because we're trying to animate the movement realistically, we're going to take a look into what air resistance actually is. Basically, air resistance is an opposing force which is going to act on your object depending on the object's speed. Basically, the faster the object is traveling, the more the air resistance is going to act on your object and push it to the other direction. So as you can see here, when the ball is moving quickly, the air resistance is affecting the cloth quite a lot. And it's making it so that the cloth is rising a lot higher to the ball trajectory. But as the ball slows down, the cloth immediately starts to fall because the force acting on it is not as big as when the ball was moving faster. Now the hair resistance doesn't have enough strength to continuously hold the cloth at its maximum range. Now the cloth is going to start falling, but due to the residual momentum in it, it's still going to hold to its previous trajectory and actually overshoot the ball when it comes to a complete stop. Now, because of momentum and tension in the cloth, it's going to continuously move back and forth when it's coming to a stop, until finally it's going to settle down completely. Here what we're going to do is basically create a small curve pattern, which is slowly becoming smaller and smaller, similarly to the way that we did with the bouncing ball. Whenever you're creating a movement which is affected by the environment, you need to take into account all the forces acting on your character details, as well as the force that the characters themselves create when they're moving. And by understanding these concepts, you're going to create the most realistic animation that you can have. The exercise in this lesson, if you haven't been following along, is to choose one of the previous exercises that we've made and add additional details onto them. For the details on the exercise in Lesson 10, you have a free choice of material and design. But for the exercise in Lesson 11, it's best if you use the actual character designs from our previous lessons. Make sure that you get the proportions and sizes correctly, and that you keep your volumes. This exercise might be especially difficult depending on the movement that you choose to make with your character. If you see that you are struggling, you can either change your character motion or simplify your character design to make something that is more manageable. The important thing is to make sure that you convey the materials of your character outfit correctly and that you can keep your details consistent. And again, same as any other exercise, try and keep your sketch as clean as possible and avoid the jittering effect. For extra difficulty, make an additional character design and try and animate it as well, to experiment with different materials and clothing cuts. Make sure that you're still conveying the correct motion and movements with the new materials and cuts. To recap, in this lesson we've learned about inherent characteristics of your materials and objects and how they affect the way that we're going to animate them. We also learned about tension and the way that it's going to affect how much deformation we're going to add to our materials to show its characteristics, as well as how to recognize and use wave patterns to show the movement of both clothing and hair due to environmental actions or your character actions using the drag principle and tension points. Next lesson, we're going to talk about effects in animation and how we're going to using similar wave patterns and material characteristics when we're trying to animate effects animation which does not have a coherent shape. Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye!